Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Tonight's episode steps into everyday encounters, where strangers don't arrive loudly, and danger doesn't announce itself. Now, let's begin. The man said my name before I had a reason to stop walking. He didn't call out or raise his voice, he said it calmly, like we were already in the middle of something, and he was simply continuing a thought. I took 2 steps before slowing down, my body reacting ahead of my mind, and when I turned, he was close enough that stepping back would have felt deliberate. We were on the same side street I used every evening, quiet but not empty, familiar enough that nothing usually demanded attention. My name is Michael. I was 34 years old then, living alone, moving through my days on habits I no longer questioned. I left work at the same time, walked the same route home, checked my phone at the same corners without thinking about it. My life had settled into something predictable enough that even small changes felt noticeable. That was why the interruption unsettled me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it fit too easily. "I didn't tell you my name," I said. He nodded once, as if I had confirmed something rather than challenged it. He looked ordinary in a way that resisted memory. Clean jacket, neutral expression, hands relaxed at his sides. Nothing about him stood out, which made it harder to decide where to focus. "You usually don't," he replied. "That's part of why this works." I frowned. "What works?" Instead of answering, he stepped aside and began walking in the same direction I had been headed. He didn't glance back to see if I followed, he didn't need to. After a moment, I fell into step beside him, more uncomfortable with standing still than with continuing. We walked in silence for a few seconds, our pace aligning without effort. "You weren't here on Tuesday," he said. I stopped. He took 2 more steps before pausing and turning to face me, waiting patiently. "Tuesday." I had worked from home that day. I hadn't told anyone outside my team, I hadn't changed anything publicly. There was no reason for a stranger to notice. "I take days off sometimes," I said. "That's normal." He considered that. "It isn't for you," he replied. "You don't like breaking sequence." The word sat wrong. It didn't sound like casual observation, it sounded procedural. "You don't know me," I said. "That's true," he agreed easily. "I know your routine." He started walking again, slower this time, leaving room for me to decide. I stayed beside him. As we moved, he mentioned small things. The corner where I usually checked my phone, the slight hesitation before I crossed even when the signal was clear. The pause I always took before unlocking my building door, as if listening for something that never arrived. None of it was secret, all of it was precise. I corrected him once, pointing out a detail he had wrong. The relief on his face was brief but real. "Good," he said. "That means nothing's drifted yet." "What is this?" I asked. "Why are you talking to me?" He didn't answer directly, he gestured ahead instead. My building was already visible at the end of the block, lobby lights on, entrance unlocked the way it always was. Seeing it framed that way made it feel staged, like a checkpoint rather than a destination. "This is just the first confirmation," he said. "Nothing changes yet." We reached the entrance. He stopped a few steps back, giving the impression that he knew exactly where his involvement ended. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Through the glass, I saw him already looking away, scanning the street as if waiting for something else to fall into place. "Tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't reassurance, it sounded like scheduling. When the elevator doors closed, the mistake finally became clear to me. I hadn't let a stranger walk me home, I had demonstrated where I ended up, at what time, and without resistance. Whatever he was tracking, whatever system he was confirming, I had just made myself easier to find. And that realization stayed with me long after the elevator reached my floor. The next day passed without incident, which unsettled me more than if something obvious had happened. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, and moved through the building the way I always did. No one mentioned anything unusual, no one asked questions. Still, I kept noticing how often my attention drifted to the time, to the small markers in my routine that usually ran without supervision. I left the office at my usual hour, walked the same route home, and found myself slowing at the same corners, not out of habit this time, but anticipation. He was already there. Not waiting in the open, not standing where I could spot him from a distance. He fell into step beside me halfway down the block, matching my pace so smoothly that I didn't hear him approach. It took a few seconds for the awareness to register, the way it does, when you realize someone has been walking next to you longer than you thought. "You adjusted your exit time," he said. I didn't look at him right away. "I left when I always do." "You hesitated at the door," he replied. 17 seconds. That number landed heavier than it should have. I stopped walking and turned to face him. He stopped too, maintaining the same distance as before, his expression unchanged. There was no satisfaction in it, no challenge, just notation. "Why are you following me?" I asked. "I'm not," he said. "I'm observing continuity, that doesn't mean anything." "It does," he replied calmly. "It just doesn't need to mean anything to you yet." We resumed walking. I didn't remember agreeing to it, only realizing that stopping again felt pointless. As we moved, he pointed out small deviations I hadn't noticed myself. A longer pause at a crosswalk. The fact that I checked my reflection in a darkened window instead of my phone. The way my pace had tightened slightly since the night before. He spoke without accusation, without emphasis, like someone reading back a list they hadn't written. "You're responding," he said. "That's expected." "To what?" I asked. "To being logged," he replied. "Most people do." I felt irritation then, sharp enough to be grounding. "You can't just track people." He nodded. "We don't track people, we track patterns. People are incidental." The word sat wrong, not threatening, dismissive. We reached my building again, and this time he didn't stop a few steps back. He stopped exactly at the edge of the entryway, close enough that anyone watching might assume he belonged there too. "You won't see me tomorrow," he said. I didn't believe him, but the statement wasn't meant to be convincing, it was informational. "Why not?" I asked. "Because you'll correct," he replied, "or you won't. Either way, the data changes." That night, I tried to disrupt everything. I took a different elevator. I stayed up later than usual. I didn't check my phone at the corners he'd mentioned. I left my apartment again after settling in, walked a few blocks without direction, then returned through a side entrance I almost never used. None of it felt satisfying. Each choice felt reactive, shaped by the very thing I was trying to escape. When I finally went to bed, sleep came unevenly. I woke several times with the sense that something had already adjusted to account for my movement. Not watched, not followed, but noted, like a system recalculating after unexpected input. The following evening, he wasn't there. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like being ignored after making too much noise. I walked my route slowly, alert to every reflection and shadow, and reached my building without interruption. Inside, everything looked normal. The lobby was quiet, the elevator arrived on time, my floor was empty. In my apartment, I noticed small things out of place. Not moved, exactly, but aligned differently than I remembered. A chair angled slightly toward the window, the light in the kitchen warmer than usual. Details subtle enough that I couldn't be sure, they hadn't always been that way. My phone buzzed just as I was considering sleep. Adjustment noted, temporary deviation acceptable. No number, no app, just the message. I stared at the screen, waiting for another explanation that didn't come. When I looked up, I realized something that made my chest tighten. The apartment felt settled, like it had already accounted for my presence tonight, my movements predicted and resolved. He hadn't needed to appear. Whatever he represented worked just as well without him, and that meant the first meeting hadn't been an introduction, it had been onboarding. By the third evening, I stopped trying to break my routine and focused, instead on observing what happened when I followed it. I left work at the same time, took the same streets, and kept my pace steady. The choice felt deliberate now, less like habit and more like compliance, but I wanted to know whether that distinction mattered. The walk home passed without interruption. No one joined me, no voice called my name. The absence felt intentional, like a test phase that had already concluded. Inside my apartment, things continued to feel subtly resolved before I interacted with them. The lights came on with a consistency that felt practiced. The air held a comfortable balance, neither warm nor cool, as if adjusted in advance. I moved through the rooms slowly, paying attention to my own behavior, noting where I paused and where I didn't. Each space seemed ready for me in a way that removed friction. I realized then that nothing was being changed in response to me anymore, it had shifted to anticipation. Later that night, I left the apartment again, not to disrupt anything, but to confirm whether the boundary still existed. I walked a few blocks farther than usual, turned down a street I rarely used, and stopped near a storefront with its lights off, and windows reflecting only darkness. I stood there for a while, waiting for the unease to catch up with me. It didn't. The street felt neutral, unconcerned with my presence. When I turned back, my phone vibrated once. Return window optimal, that was all it said. I didn't reply, I walked home. The building lobby greeted me with the same quiet order as before. Upstairs, my apartment door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it when I left. I stood there for several seconds, key still in my hand, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing moved, nothing suggested intrusion. When I stepped in, everything looked untouched. The door had not been forced, it had been left available. I locked it again, slower this time. Sleep came easily that night, and that was what finally frightened me. No interruptions, no half-waking moments, no sense of being evaluated. I slept through until morning, deeper than I had in weeks. When I woke, the feeling wasn't relief. It was alignment, the unsettling comfort of knowing nothing was expected of me in that moment, because everything had already been accounted for. At work, I noticed how easily my day unfolded. Meetings ended on time, emails resolved themselves before follow-ups were needed, small delays that usually accumulated never appeared. It felt less like good luck and more like reduced variance, as if the margin for deviation had been quietly narrowed. That evening, the man appeared again. Not beside me, not behind me, he stood across the street near my building, waiting in a way that suggested finality rather than surveillance. I crossed toward him without hesitation, aware that the decision felt inevitable rather than chosen. "You're stable now," he said. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you're predictable within acceptable limits," he replied. "You adjusted." The system responded. "That's the intended outcome. You could have just left me alone." He considered that. We did, after the initial phase. "And the messages?" "Automated," he said. "Triggered by deviation thresholds." I felt something tighten then, not fear, but recognition. "So what happens now?" He glanced at my building, then back at me. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." He stepped back, creating space between us for the first time since we'd met. "You won't see me again." I believed him this time. He walked away, unremarkable even in motion, and disappeared into the same ordinary streets I used every day. I stood there for a moment longer, then went inside. The lobby lights brightened slightly as I entered, then returned to normal. The elevator arrived immediately. In my apartment, I sat down and let the quiet settle. It felt complete now, not because I was alone, but because the space no longer needed to check. Whatever system had noticed me had finished its work, I wasn't being watched anymore. I was being relied upon. Sometimes, when I vary my routine just slightly, my phone vibrates with a brief confirmation. No instructions, no warnings, just acknowledgement. I've learned not to test the limits of it. Not because I'm afraid of consequences, but because I understand what happens to patterns that prove unreliable. They stop being included, and whatever remains continues without them. The woman spoke to me like we'd already met, and I didn't realize how strange that was until much later. It happened in a place where conversations are meant to be brief and forgettable. A waiting room with neutral walls, plastic chairs, and a television mounted too high to be useful. I had been sitting there for almost 20 minutes, flipping my phone face down and back again, trying not to watch the clock too closely. When she sat beside me, I registered her presence without looking, the way you do when someone enters a space that isn't private enough to defend. "You can go ahead of me," she said. "You're always quicker with these things." I turned then. She was already looking at me, not studying my face, not smiling, just meeting my eyes with a familiarity that didn't ask permission. Mid-30s, maybe older, hair pulled back neatly, a folder resting on her lap like she belonged there more than I did. "I think you've got me mixed up with someone else," I said. She tilted her head slightly, considering. "No," she replied. "But that's fine, it happens when people don't remember the first meeting." There was nothing confrontational in her tone, no implication that I should have remembered. Just a statement, offered and left alone. I looked around the room then, half expecting someone else to be watching us, but everyone else was absorbed in their own quiet waiting. A man filling out paperwork, a woman scrolling through her phone, normal. "We haven't met," I said, more firmly this time. She nodded, as if agreeing with a technicality. "Not properly," she said. "Not in a way that lasted." The receptionist called a name that wasn't mine. Someone stood up, the rhythm of the room resumed. I felt suddenly aware of how much attention I was giving her, how easily the rest of the space had faded. "Do you work here?" I asked. She smiled then, briefly. "No, I just come through sometimes." "For what?" "For people," she said, "when it's necessary." That should have ended the conversation, it didn't. She stayed seated, relaxed, her body language suggesting she had all the time she needed. I shifted in my chair, unsure whether standing up would feel rude or defensive. "You filled this out differently last time," she continued, tapping the edge of my clipboard lightly with one finger. I hadn't noticed her looking at it before. "You hesitated on the emergency contact." I pulled the clipboard closer to my chest. "I haven't filled this out before." She didn't argue. "You left it blank today," she said. "Before, you didn't." I scanned the page despite myself. The emergency contact section was empty, exactly as she said. I couldn't remember deciding to leave it that way. I must have. There was no one obvious to list, still, the fact that she knew made my skin prickle. "You shouldn't be looking at this," I said. She withdrew her hand immediately. "You're right," she replied. "That's on me." An apology, clean and complete. It disarmed me more than defiance would have. She leaned back in her chair, giving me space, and for a moment I thought that might be the end of it. "You handled it faster this time," she added. "That's good." "What?" I asked. "The discomfort," she said. "You recognized it sooner." I stood up then, not because I had been called, but because sitting felt like compliance. The movement drew a few glances, but no one said anything. The woman watched me calmly, hands folded over her folder. "I need to check something," I said, though I wasn't sure what. "Of course," she replied. "I'll still be here." I walked to the far side of the room, and pretended to read a poster about appointment scheduling. My heart was steady, which bothered me more than panic would have. I felt alert, awake, like my body had decided this was a situation to observe rather than escape. When I looked back, she was still there, seated exactly as before, eyes on the television now, as if our conversation had already concluded. No one else seemed to notice her. The receptionist called my name. As I stepped forward, the woman spoke again, not looking at me this time. "You won't remember this clearly later," she said. "That's normal, most people don't." I paused, hand hovering over the counter. "But you'll remember how it felt," she continued. "That part stays." I didn't respond, I didn't know how. I followed the receptionist down the hall, the sound of my footsteps too loud in my ears. When the door closed behind me, the room felt smaller, more controlled. As I sat in the examination room, waiting alone, one thought kept surfacing, quiet and persistent. She hadn't tried to convince me we'd met before, she had been checking whether I still behaved like someone who had. The appointment ended without incident, which felt deliberate rather than reassuring. The doctor asked routine questions, typed notes, and dismissed me with a polite nod that suggested nothing about the visit would follow me out the door. Still, as I walked back through the hallway toward the waiting room, I felt the same alertness settle in again, the sense that this part had already happened once before, and I was now repeating it with minor variation. She was gone. The chair beside mine was empty, the folder no longer resting on the woman's lap because the woman herself was no longer there. No one looked up, no one reacted. It was as if her absence required no acknowledgement at all. I stood near the doorway for a few seconds longer than necessary, scanning the room for any sign that someone else had noticed her leaving, but the space held its neutral rhythm. Names were called, pens scratched across paper, the television continued playing with the sound muted. I left the building feeling unsatisfied in a way that didn't match the situation. There had been no confrontation, no clear threat, nothing to resolve. The conversation had ended without closure, and that incompleteness stayed with me as I walked down the street, replaying her words without being able to anchor them to a reason. "You're always quicker with these things, you filled this out differently last time, you won't remember this clearly later." By the time I reached my car, I realized how much of my attention had shifted inward. I checked my reflection in the side window, half expecting to see something altered or out of place. Nothing looked different. I started the engine and drove home, following my usual route without meaning to. That evening, I found the first sign that something had carried over. My phone buzzed while I was making dinner. Not a call, not a text, a notification from my calendar app. I hadn't opened it in days. The reminder was simple and unremarkable. Follow-up complete, no action required. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. There was no appointment listed, no event attached, just the confirmation. I checked the app history, scrolled through past entries, but nothing matched the wording. I told myself it was a syncing error, some leftover artifact from an old reminder that hadn't cleared properly. The explanation fit well enough to move past, even if it didn't feel fully satisfying. Over the next few days, I started noticing similar moments of quiet familiarity. Small interactions that felt slightly ahead of me, as though the other person already knew how I would respond. A cashier who handed me my receipt before I reached for it, a coworker who answered a question I hadn't finished asking. None of it was dramatic, all of it was easy to dismiss individually. Taken together, it began to feel like rehearsal. The woman didn't reappear, but references to her did, indirect and impersonal. A voicemail from an unknown number that cut off before anyone spoke. A blank email draft saved on my computer, with no sender and no text, only a timestamp from earlier that day. Each time, the sensation was the same. Not fear, recognition. The feeling that something had checked in and moved on. One afternoon, I stopped at the same building again, this time for a different reason. A work errand, a document drop-off. I hadn't thought about the waiting room until I was already there, standing in the same neutral space, the same chairs arranged in the same pattern. I took a seat without thinking and waited. She wasn't there. I told myself that was expected. Still, I caught myself glancing at the chair beside me, aware of how easily my body had adjusted to the possibility. I filled out the form they handed me, and paused at the emergency contact section, pen hovering. For a moment, I couldn't remember what I had done last time. Left it blank, filled it in, corrected it later. The uncertainty irritated me more than the question itself. I left it blank. As I handed the clipboard back, a quiet certainty settled in. Not relief, confirmation. The sense that I had passed through something invisible without resistance. When my name was called, I stood up immediately, quicker than I needed to be, already moving before the sound fully registered. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the woman's voice returned without effort. Not her face, not her words exactly, just the tone she'd used, calm and assured, as if she were speaking from a position that didn't require explanation. "You handled it faster this time." I understood then that the waiting room hadn't been the point, it had been a measurement, a baseline. She hadn't needed me to remember her, because she wasn't tracking memory, she was tracking behavior. And whatever she represented was still doing so, quietly, patiently, without needing to sit beside me again. The shift happened quietly enough that I almost missed it. I noticed it one morning while standing in line for coffee, listening to the low murmur of conversation, and the hum of machines warming up for the day. The barista greeted me by name before I said anything, which wasn't unusual, but she also handed me the cup I always ordered without asking. I stood there for a second, confused, then took it anyway. The exchange was efficient, frictionless, and when I stepped aside, the line moved on as if nothing about it deserved attention. That efficiency followed me through the day. Doors opened just as I reached them, conversations ended before they became uncomfortable, emails resolved themselves with brief confirmations that didn't require replies. It felt less like good fortune and more like a narrowing of options, as if the number of possible outcomes had been quietly reduced. I didn't feel watched, I felt anticipated. That evening, my phone buzzed again. Status maintained, no further clarification needed. There was no sender, no associated app, just the message, sitting there as if it belonged. I deleted it, waited a few seconds, then locked the screen. The sense of unease didn't come from the content, it came from how little effort it took to accept it. I started testing small deviations. I took a different route home, turned down a side street I rarely used, and stopped near a storefront I had never paid attention to before. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for the internal resistance I had begun to recognize. It didn't arrive, instead, my phone vibrated once. Alternate path registered, adjustment within tolerance. I exhaled slowly, more steady than frightened. Whatever this was, it didn't require me to stay still, it required me to stay legible. The realization settled in over the next few days. People around me weren't behaving strangely, they were behaving efficiently. Interactions shortened, decisions resolved faster. Even disagreements ended before they escalated, one side conceding without quite knowing why. It felt like living inside a system that preferred momentum to friction, clarity to uncertainty. I returned to the building one final time, without a reason that made sense to anyone but me. The waiting room looked unchanged, the same chairs, the same neutral decor, the same television mounted too high. I took the same seat I had before and waited. She didn't appear. Instead, the receptionist looked up and smiled politely. "You don't need to check in," she said. "You're already cleared." "For what?" I asked. She blinked, confused, then recovered. "For today," she replied, as if that explained everything. "If you'll just wait a moment." I sat there, hands resting on my knees, and felt something settle. Not tension, completion. The sense that the process no longer required direct oversight. When I stood to leave, my phone vibrated one last time. Observation phase concluded, continued compliance inferred. That night, sleep came easily. No half-remembered conversations, no replaying of her voice. I woke rested, with the unsettling comfort of knowing nothing was pending. The absence of uncertainty felt like a reward I hadn't asked for. Days passed, then weeks. The messages stopped, the confirmations faded into routine. Life continued, smoother than before, edges worn down until choices felt obvious, and resistance felt inefficient. I learned when to move and when to wait without consciously deciding. I learned which questions to ask, and which ones would resolve themselves if left alone. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think about the woman in the waiting room. Not her face, which I can no longer recall clearly, but the way she spoke, like someone checking alignment rather than issuing instruction. She hadn't needed my trust, she hadn't needed my agreement. She had only needed to see whether I adapted, and I had. The most unsettling part isn't the idea that I was observed, it's the realization that observation ended, because it was no longer necessary. Whatever threshold had been set, I had crossed it without resistance. I wasn't being monitored anymore, I was being assumed. And the world around me continues to move accordingly, efficient and accommodating, as long as I don't give it a reason to slow down. The first time he corrected me, I assumed he was just being helpful. It happened in the lobby of my office building, a place designed to move people through quickly without encouraging conversation. I was heading toward the security desk to sign in a visitor, when a man standing near the directory cleared his throat softly, and spoke without turning fully toward me. "That's not the form you need," he said. "They changed it last month." I paused, pen already in hand. The clipboard I was holding looked exactly the same as it always had, but I hesitated anyway, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. He wasn't wearing a uniform, no badge, just a neutral jacket, pressed slacks, shoes clean enough to suggest intention rather than habit. "I've used this one before," I said. He nodded, like that was expected. "You can still use it," he replied. "It'll just slow things down." I glanced at the security desk. The guard hadn't reacted. No one else seemed to be paying attention. I set the clipboard down and reached for the other stack, the one I hadn't noticed before, thinner and tucked slightly out of sight. The man stepped back immediately, giving me space, as if his involvement ended the moment I complied. "Thanks," I said, mostly out of reflex. "You're welcome," he replied, already turning away. The rest of the morning went smoothly, too smoothly. The visitor arrived on time, the meeting ended early, emails resolved themselves before follow-ups became necessary. I didn't connect any of it to the man in the lobby until later, when I realized how often my day had benefited from small, well-timed adjustments I hadn't consciously made. I saw him again at lunch. This time he was seated at a table near the window in a cafe I visited regularly, eating slowly, methodically, as if time wasn't a factor. When I joined the line, he glanced up and shook his head once. "They're short a cook," he said. "It'll take longer than usual." I checked the menu board, then the line. He was right. Without responding, I stepped out and went next door instead. As I passed him, he met my eyes briefly and gave a small nod, not approval, just acknowledgement. It was only afterward that the discomfort settled in. He hadn't asked me anything, he hadn't offered options, he had simply corrected my course, and I had accepted it without resistance. The choice felt reasonable, efficient. That was what made it hard to object to in hindsight. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. A quiet suggestion at a crosswalk about which signals cycled faster, a brief comment in a parking garage, about which level filled up first. A correction about which elevator was being serviced, offered just early enough to redirect me without delay. He never stopped me outright, he never touched me, he never raised his voice. He appeared, corrected, and disappeared, each interaction brief enough to dismiss on its own. I started noticing how often I looked for him. Not consciously at first, just a quick scan of a space before making small decisions. Which line to stand in, which door to take, whether to wait or move. When he wasn't there, I felt a mild irritation, like missing a familiar signpost. The first time I ignored him was accidental. I was leaving work later than usual, tired and distracted, when I heard his voice behind me, calm and precise. "That route's closed," he said. "Maintenance." I didn't stop. I waved a hand over my shoulder and kept walking, already committed to the turn. The street was open, no barriers, no signs. I felt a small, defiant satisfaction at continuing anyway. 2 blocks later, I hit the closure. Actual maintenance, flooded pavement. Police tape stretched across the road. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the obstruction, aware of how easily it could have been avoided. When I turned around, he was gone. That night, I found myself replaying the moment less with annoyance than curiosity. It wasn't that he'd been right, people are right all the time. It was the timing. The way the correction had arrived just before the consequence, like a system trying to preserve momentum. The next morning, I saw him again, waiting near the building entrance. "You didn't need to test it," he said, not accusing, just noting. "But it's good that you did." "Who are you?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "I help prevent unnecessary friction," he said. "You tend to generate it when left alone. That's not your decision to make." He smiled faintly. "It doesn't have to be." He stepped aside, clearing the doorway, and for a moment I stood there, aware of the choice in front of me. Walk past him and accept the correction, or hesitate and force the day to unfold without guidance. I went inside. Behind me, I heard him speak again, his voice even, already disengaging. "We'll keep it minimal," he said. "You respond better that way." By the time I reached my desk, the unease had settled into something heavier than irritation. The man wasn't following me, he was refining me, and I had the growing sense that the longer I allowed it, the less visible his involvement would become. The corrections didn't stop after that, they became quieter. I noticed it first in the way he stopped positioning himself directly in my path. Instead of appearing where decisions were obvious, he stayed just close enough to be peripheral. Reflections in glass, a pause behind me in a crowd, a presence registered only after the decision had already shifted. By the time I realized I'd adjusted my behavior, the opportunity to question it had passed. The unsettling part wasn't that he was often right, it was that I stopped evaluating whether he was. At work, small choices resolved themselves without friction. I selected meeting rooms that happened to be available. I sent emails at moments that received immediate replies. I avoided conversations that would have gone nowhere, though I couldn't always explain how I knew. The day moved smoothly, efficiently, like something with its rough edges sanded down. He didn't speak every time, sometimes the correction came as an absence. A line I didn't join, a door I didn't open, a thought I abandoned halfway through forming it. I would catch myself mid-action and adjust without knowing why, only realizing afterward that the outcome had improved. The pattern became familiar enough that I stopped searching for its source, until the first time it failed. It happened in a parking garage late in the evening. The structure was mostly empty, concrete levels echoing faintly with distant engines. I was walking toward my car when I felt the hesitation hit, the subtle internal resistance I'd learned to recognize, as a signal to reconsider. I slowed instinctively, scanning the space for him, expecting a quiet correction. He wasn't there. I dismissed the feeling and kept going. Nothing happened, no threat, no delay. I unlocked my car, got in, and drove out without incident. The absence bothered me more than any mistake would have. I had expected guidance. The lack of it felt like a lapse. The next morning, he appeared again, standing near the entrance of my building, like he had always belonged there. "You didn't need intervention yesterday," he said. "I didn't ask for it," I replied. He nodded, accepting that. "You've internalized most of it," he said. "That's the goal." I stopped walking. "So this ends when I don't need you anymore?" He considered the question carefully. "It ends when you stop creating unnecessary resistance," he replied. "Whether I'm present or not becomes irrelevant." I felt irritation rise, sharper than before. "You're not improving my life. You're just making it narrower." He smiled faintly, "Those are often the same thing." The rest of the day unfolded with uncomfortable clarity. I noticed how often I preemptively chose the least disruptive option. How rarely I paused long enough to feel uncertainty. Decisions that once carried weight now resolved themselves, before I could sit with them. Efficiency replaced preference, momentum replaced choice. That night, I tried to force friction back in. I took a longer route home. I stood in a line that was clearly moving slower. I delayed responding to messages that usually received immediate replies. Each action felt awkward, like using my non-dominant hand. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the day lost its smoothness. Minor inconveniences stacked up, conversations dragged, time felt heavier, less cooperative. I realized then what the corrections had been doing. They weren't preventing harm, they were removing pause. Without pause, there was no space to reconsider. Without reconsideration, behavior settled into patterns that optimized for flow rather than intention. The man hadn't been changing my outcomes, he had been compressing the distance between decision and result. The next time I saw him, I didn't wait for him to speak. "You're not guiding me," I said. "You're conditioning me." He didn't deny it. "Guidance requires consent," he replied. "Conditioning just requires repetition." "And what happens if I stop responding?" He looked at me for a long moment, longer than he ever had before. "Then friction returns," he said. "And systems don't like friction." He stepped away after that, disappearing into the crowd without ceremony. I stood there, aware that nothing visible had changed. No threat had been issued, no warning delivered. But for the first time since meeting him, my decisions felt heavy again, and I couldn't tell whether that weight was something I had lost, or something I was about to lose completely. The day the corrections stopped entirely, the silence felt deliberate. I noticed it in small ways at first. I stood at a crosswalk longer than necessary, waiting for the familiar internal pressure to shift me one way or the other. It didn't come. The signal changed, people moved, and I followed without resistance. The absence wasn't relief, it felt like a hand withdrawn at the exact moment you'd learned to lean on it. At work, the day unfolded unevenly. Meetings ran long. A document was returned with vague feedback instead of approval. I found myself rereading emails before sending them, uncertain in a way I hadn't been for weeks. Nothing went wrong in any obvious sense, but the smoothness I'd grown used to was gone, replaced by friction I couldn't avoid or shortcut. I kept looking for him. Not anxiously, not consciously, just the way you scan for a familiar shape, when something you rely on fails to show up. Near entrances, along corridors, in reflections, he didn't appear. By late afternoon, the realization settled in, that this wasn't an oversight, it was a transition. I felt it most strongly on the way home. I reached the corner where I usually slowed, the place he'd corrected me more than once, and hesitated out of habit. No suggestion arrived, no subtle resistance. I chose a direction at random, and immediately felt the weight of that choice. The route wasn't worse, it was simply unassisted. 2 blocks in, I understood what had changed. Without correction, every decision carried consequence again. Not dramatic consequence, just a quiet accumulation of outcomes that hadn't been smoothed or redirected. I missed a timing window, and waited through an extra light cycle. A store I'd planned to stop at, was closed earlier than expected. Small things, individually meaningless, but together they made the walk feel longer than it should have. At home, the feeling followed me inside. I stood in my kitchen unsure where to start, aware of how often I'd let momentum decide for me lately. I cooked, ate, and cleaned without guidance, and the process felt inefficient in a way that bordered on exhausting. It wasn't that I'd become incapable, it was that I'd grown accustomed to not having to choose. Later that evening, my phone vibrated. Not a message, not a notification, just a single line on a blank screen. Manual operation resumed, monitor variance. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. The phrasing unsettled me more than any instruction would have. Not because it threatened action, but because it framed autonomy as a temporary state. Something granted, not inherent. Something that required observation. I didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. Over the next few days, life continued without visible interference. No man appeared to correct my course, no voice redirected my decisions. Still, I felt the presence of evaluation return, quieter than before, less personal. The pressure wasn't on my choices anymore, it was on my consistency. I noticed myself adapting. I began choosing the most predictable option without thinking about it. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt safer to remain legible. I avoided unnecessary detours, I simplified routines, I reduced variation where I could. The habits settled in naturally, each one a small concession that made the day move more easily. One evening, as I was leaving work, I saw him again. He stood across the street, not watching me directly, just present in the way he always had been. I didn't approach him, I didn't need to. He met my eyes briefly and nodded, a gesture without approval or judgment. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "This phase doesn't require much input." "What happens next?" I asked. He considered the question, then shrugged lightly. "Nothing noticeable," he replied. "That's how you'll know it worked." He turned and walked away, before I could say anything else, blending into the same ordinary movement, as everyone around him. I stood there for a moment longer, then continued home. The world feels normal again now. Decisions happen, days pass, nothing corrects me openly. But every so often, when I hesitate too long, or consider a deviation I don't need, I feel the old resistance surface, faint but familiar. Not a command, not a voice. Just the quiet understanding that unnecessary friction will be noted, and that I've already demonstrated how easily it can be removed. The first time the call came, I assumed it was a mistake. The number wasn't saved. No name, no area code I recognized. I let it ring until it stopped, then set my phone face down and went back to what I was doing. A few minutes later, it rang again. Same number, same calm persistence. I answered the second time out of irritation more than curiosity. "You're about to make a decision you don't need to," a man said. His voice was even, unhurried, like he was reading a note rather than interrupting my day. There was no background noise, no indication of where he was calling from. "I think you have the wrong number," I replied. "No," he said. "You're standing in your kitchen, you've opened the fridge twice, you're deciding whether to leave or stay in." I didn't move. The fridge door was still open, the light inside hummed softly. "Who is this?" I asked. "That doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is that you don't overthink the next 10 minutes. I closed the fridge slowly. "You shouldn't be saying any of this." "I won't again," he said. "This is just a correction." The line went dead. I stood there for a while, phone still in my hand, waiting for the panic to arrive. It didn't. Instead, a dull irritation settled in, the kind you feel when someone interferes, with something minor and inconvenient. I told myself it had to be coincidence. Someone guessing, someone fishing. The details were ordinary enough to be lucky. I went out anyway. The restaurant I'd been considering was crowded, louder than I'd expected, and by the time I got a table, the irritation had faded into something like relief. The food arrived quickly. The evening passed without friction. By the time I got home, the call felt distant, easier to dismiss as a strange interruption, that didn't need meaning attached to it. The second call came 3 days later. This time, I was already holding the phone when it rang, scrolling without reading, killing time between tasks. The same number appeared, I answered without thinking. "You're going to say yes," the man said. "And then regret the way it drags out." I sat down. "Say yes to what?" There was a pause, brief but intentional. "You haven't been asked yet," he replied. "You will be." 10 minutes later, my supervisor called. A favor, a small request. Extra responsibility, temporary, framed as an opportunity. I listened, phone pressed to my ear, the man's words replaying quietly in the background. When the question came, I hesitated just long enough to feel the shape of the decision. I said no. There was surprise on the other end. Mild disappointment, nothing dramatic. The call ended politely. When I lowered my phone, I realized my hand was shaking. The stranger didn't call again that day. After that, the pattern established itself with unsettling efficiency. The calls were infrequent. Always brief, always just ahead of something that hadn't happened yet. He never told me what to do outright. He framed everything as avoidance, prevention, efficiency. "You don't need that conversation. That route adds time without benefit. This isn't the moment to explain yourself." Each time, I resisted the urge to hang up. Each time, I told myself I was listening out of disbelief, not trust. And each time, when the moment arrived, his guidance aligned cleanly with the outcome that felt easiest to live with. What unsettled me wasn't that he was right, it was that his version of right always involved less explanation, less confrontation, less exposure. He corrected decisions before they became visible. He reduced moments that required justification. One evening, I ignored him on purpose. The phone rang while I was walking toward a conversation I had been putting off for weeks. I silenced it and kept going. The talk happened anyway. It was messy, emotional, necessary. I went home exhausted, but certain I had done the right thing. The phone rang again an hour later. "You see," he said calmly. "That took more out of you than it returned." "You don't get to decide that," I replied. "I don't decide," he said. "I minimize." I stopped walking. "Why me?" Another pause. "Because you hesitate," he said. "And hesitation creates openings." After that, the calls changed tone. Not more aggressive, more confident. He no longer sounded like someone offering suggestions, he sounded like someone adjusting variables. I began to notice how much quieter my life became when I listened. Fewer explanations, shorter conversations, cleaner exits. Decisions that closed doors before they could invite follow-up questions. The cost didn't arrive all at once. It showed up gradually, in the way people stopped asking me certain things, in how expectations adjusted around my silence. I was easier to place, easier to predict. The last call of that week came late at night. "You don't need to answer this one," the man said, already knowing I had. "I just needed to confirm you're still receptive." I didn't reply. "That's fine," he continued. "You don't have to agree, you just have to keep letting the unnecessary parts fall away." The line disconnected. I sat there in the dark, phone warm in my hand, realizing something I hadn't wanted to admit before. The calls weren't stopping my choices, they were editing them, and the longer I allowed it, the harder it became to tell what I would have chosen on my own. The calls didn't come every day after that, which made them harder to anticipate and easier to accept. There was no pattern I could pin down, no schedule I could prepare for. Sometimes days passed in complete silence, long enough for me to convince myself that whatever had been happening had run its course. Then the phone would ring at exactly the wrong moment, when a decision was already forming, but hadn't yet settled. "You don't need to explain that," he said once, just as I was drafting a message I had rewritten 3 times already. I froze, thumb hovering over the screen. The message was to a friend, nothing urgent, just a response that carried more honesty than I usually allowed myself. I deleted it instead and sent a shorter version. Polite, closed. When the reply came back, it matched the tone perfectly. The exchange ended there, clean and contained. I told myself that wasn't influence, it was coincidence layered on timing. Still, I started noticing how often my phone was already in my hand, when the calls came, as if some part of me had learned to prepare. I would answer without checking the number, already bracing for the correction, and each time his voice arrived calm and measured, never rushed, never raised. "This one creates follow-up," he said one afternoon while I stood in a grocery aisle, staring at 2 nearly identical items. "You won't want that later." I put one back without arguing and felt a small, immediate relief, like avoiding a problem I hadn't yet experienced. The sensation lingered longer than it should have. The corrections never forced me into action. They narrowed things, reduced complexity. Decisions that once branched outward, now folded inward neatly, resolving themselves before they required commitment. I wasn't being directed, I was being streamlined. The first time I asked him to stop, the request surprised both of us. "I don't need these calls," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You can take me off whatever list this is." There was a brief pause, not hesitation, consideration. "That would add difficulty," he replied. "For you." I didn't agree to this. "You don't have to agree," he said. "You just have to keep answering." The line went quiet, then disconnected. I stood there staring at my phone, aware that nothing had changed. The next call still came when it wanted to. At work, people began adjusting around me in subtle ways. Fewer open-ended questions, less expectation of explanation. When I declined something, it was accepted quickly, without probing. When I left early, no one commented. I was becoming easier to manage, and that ease reflected back at me as quiet approval. One evening, I missed a call. The phone buzzed in my pocket while I was in the shower, muffled enough that I didn't hear it, until I stepped out and saw the missed notification. No voicemail, no follow-up, just the absence. The rest of the night felt off balance, small things took longer, a conversation stalled awkwardly. I second-guessed a choice that would normally have resolved itself. The ease I'd grown used to didn't return, and the effort required to move through the evening felt disproportionate, like friction introduced into a system that had already been optimized. The next call came the following morning. "You noticed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's the problem." "It means you're paying attention," he said. "That's progress." "I don't want this to be easier," I said. "I want it to be mine." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed, but something underneath it had settled. "Ease is what allows ownership to feel optional," he said. "Without it, most people ask to be guided." I didn't ask. "No," he agreed. "But you responded." The call ended, leaving the words hanging. I sat there longer than necessary, replaying them. Responded, not agreed, not consented, just responded. That night, when the phone rang again, I didn't answer right away. I let it ring, watching the screen light up and dim. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Eventually, the ringing stopped. For the first time since the calls had started, nothing followed. I didn't feel relieved. I felt exposed, like I had stepped out of something that had been quietly shaping the edges of my life, leaving me suddenly aware of how much had been removed. And how little resistance I'd offered, while it was happening. The silence after that lasted longer than I expected. Days passed without a call, then a week. I stopped checking my phone reflexively, stopped bracing for interruption before decisions formed. At first, the absence felt like relief, the kind that arrives after something irritating finally ends. But as time went on, the quiet began to feel provisional, like a pause rather than a conclusion. Life grew louder again, conversations stretched longer than necessary. Decisions reopened themselves after I thought they were settled. People asked follow-up questions I had forgotten how to answer. I found myself explaining motives, clarifying tone, revisiting choices that would have closed cleanly weeks earlier. None of it was dramatic, but it required effort, the kind of effort I hadn't realized I'd stopped making. One evening, I stood in my living room holding my phone, staring at the dark screen, and understood something uncomfortable. The calls hadn't taken control away from me, they had taken responsibility. They had absorbed the weight of choosing, when to engage and when to withdraw, leaving me with outcomes that felt clean but unearned. That was when the phone rang again. Same number, same calm persistence. I answered without sitting down. "You're drifting," the man said. "I'm deciding," I replied. "That's inefficient," he said. "You were functioning better before." "Better for who?" "For everyone," he said. "Including you." I felt irritation rise, sharper than before. "You don't get to define that." "I don't define it," he replied. "I measure it." I moved to the window, looking out at the street below, people passing without awareness of the calculations that shaped their evenings. "Then measure this," I said. "I'm done answering." There was a pause, longer than usual. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't shifted, but the certainty beneath it had adjusted. "That will create noise," he said. "You won't like it." "Maybe," I replied. "But at least it'll be mine." The line stayed open for a moment longer, as if waiting for correction. None came, the call ended without acknowledgement. After that, the world resisted me again. Not aggressively, not maliciously, just honestly. I waited longer, I misjudged timing. I said things that required explanation. Some conversations went poorly, others surprised me by lasting longer than they should have. I felt tired in a way I hadn't in weeks, but the fatigue carried a strange clarity with it, the sense that effort and outcome were finally aligned again. Then the second phase began. The phone didn't ring, but the guidance returned in quieter forms. Emails drafted themselves shorter than I intended. Conversations ended abruptly when I paused too long. Invitations stopped arriving without explanation. It wasn't that someone was telling me what to do anymore, it was that the environment had learned what I accepted when things were simplified. I realized then that the calls had never been the system, they had been the interface. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, the phone lit up without sound. No incoming call, no vibration, just a line of text on a blank screen. Excess friction detected, recommend reduction. I stared at it, waiting for the familiar sense of relief to arrive. It didn't. Instead, I felt something else, quieter and more stubborn. I turned the phone face down. Nothing happened, no escalation, no warning, no correction. The world continued on, messy and inefficient and demanding. I slept poorly. I woke up uncertain. I made choices that didn't resolve themselves neatly, and with each one, the pull to simplify returned, tempting and reasonable. In the days that followed, I noticed how easily I could bring the quiet back. All it took was silence. Short answers, fewer explanations, declining without elaboration. Each time I did, the world smoothed slightly, rewarding me without acknowledgement. I understood then what the man had been doing from the beginning. He hadn't been removing my choices, he had been training me to remove them myself. The calls never returned after that, they didn't need to. The system had already learned the version of me that responded best, the one that accepted efficiency over friction, simplicity over ownership. Some days, I resisted. Other days, when the noise builds and the effort feels unnecessary, I feel my answers shorten, my pauses disappear, my decisions close early. The world responds immediately, relieved. That's when I know the stranger hasn't gone anywhere, he's just waiting to see how much of the work I'm willing to do for him. The stranger didn't arrive suddenly, he arrived in pieces. I noticed the first one at the grocery store, standing where my neighbor usually did, when she debated between brands she never bought. It was the same aisle, the same time of evening, the same mild impatience in the air. I assumed he was just another customer until he reached for the item she always chose and placed it back on the shelf, replacing it with the cheaper version beside it. The gesture was careful, practiced, like he had done it many times before. "You don't need that one," he said, "not to me, not to anyone in particular. This works the same." The words were familiar enough that I almost nodded, before realizing he wasn't speaking to me. My neighbor wasn't there at all. The space beside him was empty, the cart untouched, the decision already concluded without the person who usually made it. I moved on, unsettled but unconvinced. People talked to themselves in public places all the time. It didn't mean anything, it didn't need to. The second piece appeared 2 days later. I was in the lobby of my building, waiting for the elevator, when a man stepped out just as the doors began to close. He held them open with one hand and glanced at me briefly, like he recognized me from somewhere unimportant. "She takes the stairs on Wednesdays," he said. "Who?" I asked. He blinked, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Sorry," he replied. "Habit." The doors closed behind him. I stood there alone, replaying the sentence, "Wednesdays." My upstairs neighbor usually took the stairs on Wednesdays, because the elevator ran slower after maintenance. I knew that, I didn't know why this man did. Over the next week, the fragments accumulated. A man at the bus stop stepped forward, when an elderly woman wasn't there yet, waving the bus past without hesitation. "She waits for the next one," he said to the driver. The driver nodded and pulled away. No one questioned it. At work, a colleague answered a question meant for someone else, using phrasing that sounded borrowed. "He prefers it this way," she said, gesturing vaguely. The meeting moved on. Each moment on its own was easy to dismiss. People make assumptions, people fill gaps. What unsettled me was how accurate those assumptions were, how seamlessly they replaced the people who were supposed to be there. I noticed the stranger again in my building's laundry room. He stood near the dryers, folding clothes that weren't his, sorting them with quiet efficiency. When I hesitated in the doorway, he looked up and nodded once. "She forgets to check the lint trap," he said. I already did. There was no accusation in his voice. No performance, just a statement of completion. The machine finished its cycle and shut off, the load resolved. I didn't ask who he meant, the question felt unnecessary. "You shouldn't be doing that," I said anyway. He shrugged lightly, "It keeps things moving." I started paying attention after that. Not just to him, but to the way people stepped aside when he spoke, the way decisions concluded faster in his presence. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't assert authority, he simply spoke as if continuity mattered more than permission. And more often than not, he was right. One evening, I found him standing outside my apartment door. Not blocking it, not waiting expectantly, just there, holding a package I hadn't ordered. "You weren't home earlier," he said. I signed for it. I took the box without thinking, it had my name on it. The handwriting was neat, practiced, like someone used to filling things in. "You shouldn't do that," I said again. He met my eyes, patient. "You didn't object before." I tried to remember when I had agreed, I couldn't. That night, I replayed the week carefully, lining up each encounter, each correction made on behalf of someone who hadn't asked for it. The pattern was clearer now. The stranger wasn't replacing people violently or dramatically, he was stepping into the pauses they left behind, smoothing things over so no one had to wait. The unsettling realization came slowly. He wasn't pretending to be anyone specific, he was becoming whoever didn't show up. And the more efficiently he did it, the less anyone seemed to notice the difference. By the time I went to bed, one thought kept returning, steady and unwelcome. If he could stand in for everyone else so easily, how long before someone decided he could stand in for me too? The replacement didn't announce itself as escalation, it arrived as confirmation. I realized it one morning when my phone buzzed with a message from my building's management office, thanking me for reporting a maintenance issue I hadn't reported. The wording was polite, efficient, already resolved. The issue itself was real enough, a leak in the laundry room that had been dripping for weeks, but I hadn't said anything about it. I had assumed someone else would. Apparently, someone had. Later that day, I saw the stranger again near the mailboxes. He was sorting envelopes into neat stacks, discarding junk mail into the recycling bin with practiced speed. When he noticed me watching, he didn't stop. He simply adjusted the pile to include mine. "You were going to throw these out anyway," he said. It was true, I took the stack without responding, aware of how easily the exchange concluded. No argument, no justification. The moment resolved itself before it could become uncomfortable. That ease spread. I began hearing about things I had apparently handled. A neighbor thanked me for letting the delivery driver into the building. A coworker referenced a conversation we hadn't had, one that had apparently settled a scheduling conflict. Each time, the outcome benefited me. Fewer obligations, fewer follow-ups. Decisions already made in my favor. I asked around carefully, framing questions as casual curiosity rather than concern. No one described the same man the same way. Some said it was a tenant from another floor, others thought he worked for the building. A few assumed he was a friend of mine. No one seemed unsettled by his presence. If anything, people spoke about him with mild appreciation, the way you talk about someone who keeps things running smoothly. I confronted him in the stairwell that evening. He was leaning against the railing, phone in his hand, already finishing a message when I reached him. He looked up as if he had been expecting me, but not urgently. You can't keep doing things for me, I said. He considered that. I'm not doing them for you, he replied. I'm doing them instead. That's worse. He smiled faintly. Only if you miss the effort. The stairwell felt narrower than usual, the sound of our voices absorbed by concrete. I noticed then how comfortable he seemed in shared spaces, places where no one lingered long enough to claim ownership. I didn't ask you to step in, I said. You didn't need to, he replied. You hesitate. That's usually enough. That word again, hesitate. It had followed me through this entire series of encounters, attaching itself to every gap I left unfilled. People should be allowed to hesitate, I said. They are, he agreed. That's how I know where to stand. After that, I tried to assert myself in small ways. I corrected people when they thanked me for things I hadn't done, I declined favors that had already been arranged, I reopened decisions that had been settled without me. Each time, the response was the same. Mild confusion, polite resistance. A sense that I was undoing something that had worked just fine. The stranger never argued with me directly, he didn't need to. The environment pushed back on its own. When I refused a delivery he had signed for, the driver sighed, and mentioned how helpful the other guy usually was. When I insisted on handling an issue myself, the management office warned me about delays. When I contradicted a decision he'd made at work, my supervisor asked why I was creating extra steps. Efficiency had shifted away from me. I began to understand the structure forming around us. The stranger wasn't forcing replacement, he was offering relief, and the system preferred relief to accuracy. People didn't need the right person, they needed a person who would respond quickly and close the loop. One night, I returned home to find my apartment door unlocked. Nothing inside was disturbed, no drawers opened, no items missing. The lights were off, the air was still. On the kitchen counter lay a note written in careful, familiar handwriting. You were taking too long. I didn't call the police, I didn't tell anyone. The explanation felt obvious enough to silence those impulses. He hadn't broken in, he had stepped in. I locked the door and sat down, heart steady, mind uncomfortably clear. The stranger wasn't trying to take my place all at once, he was doing something more effective. He was demonstrating that the space I occupied could function without me present. And once that was proven, the question wasn't whether he would replace me, it was whether anyone would notice when he did. The transition completed itself without ceremony. I noticed it the first time someone addressed him using my name. It happened in the lobby, early in the evening, the hour when people passed through, without stopping long enough to correct small errors. I was standing near the mailboxes when a delivery driver approached the stranger, glanced at his phone, and nodded. Got something for you, he said. You're usually quicker than this. The stranger accepted the package without correcting him. He didn't look at me, he didn't hesitate. He signed my name in a version of handwriting that was close enough to mine that I felt a brief, disorienting flicker of recognition. I stepped forward. That's mine. Both men turned toward me. The driver frowned slightly, not confused exactly, just recalculating. Oh, he said, sorry. He usually handles it. The stranger met my eyes then, not apologetic, not defensive, just attentive. You weren't available, he said. It didn't make sense to delay. The driver handed me the clipboard to confirm the correction, but the moment had already passed. The exchange had resolved itself, before I could reclaim it. The stranger stepped away calmly, his role complete, and the driver left without further comment. That was how it began to feel everywhere. Conversations ended when he spoke, decisions settled when he intervened. People deferred to him without checking whether they should. Not because he demanded it, but because he carried himself, like someone already assigned to the gap. When I tried to assert myself, the response was always the same mild resistance, the quiet suggestion that I was complicating something that had already been handled. At work, I overheard my supervisor thanking him for stepping in while I was busy. The tone was appreciative, relieved. I interrupted to clarify the mistake, but the explanation landed awkwardly, like an unnecessary footnote. The meeting continued without adjustment. Later that day, an email circulated confirming a change I hadn't approved, attributed to me anyway. My name at the bottom, my preference summarized correctly. The outcome exactly what I would have chosen, if I'd been forced to decide quickly. That was the most unsettling part. He didn't replace me badly, he replaced me efficiently. I confronted him in the hallway outside my apartment that night. "You can't keep using my name," I said. He considered that, then nodded once. "I won't need to much longer." "What does that mean?" "It means people don't need labels once behavior stabilizes," he replied. "They respond to consistency." The hallway felt narrower than usual, the walls closer, as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate the exchange. I realized then, how rarely I occupied shared areas long enough to claim them. How often I hesitated, how often I left space unfilled. "You're erasing me," I said. He shook his head. "I'm preserving function." That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the building settle. Doors opened and closed, elevators hummed. Somewhere below, someone laughed briefly, then stopped. Life continued with or without me. In the morning, my phone was full of confirmations. Tasks completed, requests resolved, appointments adjusted. All things I might have done eventually, already finished in my absence. No one asked where I had been, no one noticed the delay. I tried withdrawing deliberately after that. I spoke more, I lingered in conversations. I reinserted myself into decisions already made. Each attempt felt like friction introduced into a system that had learned to move without me. People grew impatient, explanations wore thin. The stranger didn't argue, he didn't need to. The environment corrected me instead. One evening, I returned home to find my apartment key no longer worked. The lock wasn't broken, it had been rekeyed. Inside, I could hear movement, quiet and familiar. Someone opening a cabinet, someone moving through the space with practiced ease. I stood there longer than I should have, hand resting uselessly on the knob, understanding finally what had happened. I hadn't been pushed out, I had been outpaced. The stranger opened the door from the inside. "You took too long," he said gently. People adjusted. I looked past him at my apartment, unchanged, orderly, functioning. It looked like it always had, only steadier, more complete. He stepped aside, not to let me in, but to let me see. "They don't need both of us," he said. "And they've already chosen the version that responds." I stood there, aware that nothing dramatic had occurred. No struggle, no removal, just replacement by continuity. The door closed softly, and on the other side of it, life continued at the same pace it always had, only now without waiting for me to catch up. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Before you drift back into the dark, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and which moment stayed with you the longest. Your whispers guide the night still waiting to unfold. Sleep well, if you can.